Well, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is great to see you this morning. We are, as you heard, launching a new series called Shareable, You're Trending Now. And one of the things that we're going to be doing, as Pastor Ian mentioned, is we have connection groups that meet throughout the week, and we would love for you to get into a group. And so if you're a group host, all the material is available for you out in the gazebo area, the lobby area. And so we want to invite you to grab that. We have 3 different ways that you can access our material online. We have flash drives, and we have DVDs, and so you can grab those today. If you're not in a group, we would love for you to join a group. We have groups all throughout the week, all over the city. And so we want to invite you to join one. And if that doesn't work in your schedule, we want to invite you to launch your own group with your family, with your friends, and with your neighbors. So the best way to really engage in this series is not just on a weekend, but also through the week. And so we want to invite you to jump in to a group. As you can see, we have a pool up here. And so if you want to come and have a spa afterwards, no, I'm kidding. But it's Baptism Sunday. And so this is one of the most significant days on the calendar for me. And for some of you, it will be. We've seen in the last 2 years, 375 people get baptized. How about that? We are going to add to that number today, and here's why we are so excited about those numbers, because every number has a name, and every name has a story, and every story belongs to God. And so we're excited about how God is going to bring life change this morning. You proved something to me earlier this morning. We had our shareable moment during our worship through song, where you were taking photos and posting those. What you proved to me, really 2 things this morning. The first is that you have followers. You have followers on your social media, whatever it is that you're using, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Pigeons. I don't know what it is that you use, but you have followers. And the second thing that you proved to me was that people are interested in you. They may not talk to you in real life, but they will put like on Facebook, right? And people are interested in what you're doing, which really it means this, that what you do with your life, it actually matters. That the choices you make, decisions you make, the way you engage with people, it matters because you have influence over those that you know, whether it be a husband or a wife or a significant other, or maybe it's your kids or nieces or nephews or family or neighbors. You have influence over people you know, but you also have influence over those you don't know. You also have influence over people that may be watching you from a distance. And one of the things that we say all the time, and if you've been to First Step with us, you've heard this, is that we believe that God has brought you here for a specific purpose. We believe that God brought you here for somebody else. God has added you to YCC for somebody else, and you probably haven't met them yet, but there's something in your story that could change their life. There's something about what God is doing in you that could shape them and send them in the direction of Jesus. And you thought you were just here because Ian preaches well, or that James's hair is awesome. You thought you were here because of that. But the reality is that you're here because God is wanting to do something in your life and do something through your life. And that's why this series, #Shareable, You're Trending Now. Now, I want to catch everybody up because I'm a big believer and not everybody understands trends and hashtags. And so let me explain this. The hashtag represents what's being spoken about, what's being watched, what's being made known, what's being discussed. And for those of you that are a little bit older, yes, it is the pound sign. But the hashtag is the way that you prioritize what's being discussed. And so what I did this week is I did a little Google search as to the most popular hashtags in 2016, and here's some that I found. The first one was #email fail, and it goes like this. My mom emailed me and said, "Your dad and I are going to divorce next month." She meant to say Disney. Also #email fail. My dad once typed out an entire email in the subject bar. Anybody? Come on. Thank you. All right. How about #myWeirdSecret? I had a dead battery collection when I was little. I would spread them out on my bed and just stare at them. That was my hashtag. No, I'm kidding. #WhyI'mSingle. When I had a boyfriend, I brought him over to meet my parents, and my dad pretended to rob us to see if he would protect me. Oh, I'm writing that one down. Okay. #WhyI'mSingle. One time I told a girl she was beautiful, and after she responded with "thank you," I said, "Yeah, I've been watching you a lot." This series is going to be so significant for you and for me. And that's why shareable is so important, because everything we do is shareable. And let's be honest, because we're in church, and this should be the most honest place on the planet, that sometimes our social media doesn't look like something that we would want to share, would it? Does it? I mean, sometimes our social media, and it's not universally, but for a lot of us, it might look something like this. I hate these people. These people are evil. Hey, come to church with me. Here's a picture of my puppy. Or maybe for you, it's I don't like these people. I'm arguing with these people. Hey, come to church with me. Kitty cats. You know? And I think often, and the reason why we got really quiet there is because we know that it's true. We know that we have found ourselves not being something that would be positive in the social media world, and not being something that we would really want to have shared with people around us. Sometimes we allow the darkness in us to get the best of us. And it's really the difference in a life that's lived with nothing off limits versus a life where it's nothing but foolishness. Nothing off limits means that you're going to ask the questions that haven't been asked. But you're going to ask those questions to somebody that can get you from where you're at to where you want to go. It's not going to be blasted across a social media device. Nothing off limits means that you're going to engage and make choices that help you become what God has created you to be. And again, you're going to find people that can get you from where you're at to where you want to go. A nothing but foolishness life is one that complains, one that argues, and one that blames. And we have a saying around here, to blame is to be lame. We don't want to be people that just blame. We don't want to be people that just point. We want to be people that spread hope. And knowing the difference is knowing where you have placed your hope. My hope, and for some of you this morning, your hope is not in a thing or an idea, but in a person. And that person is Jesus Christ. We have placed our hope in the strong, capable hands of Jesus, and He can handle everything that I bring to Him and everything that you bring to Him. That's who we've placed our hope in. In fact, there's one writer, his name is Paul. He wrote most of what we call the New Testament in the Bible. And when Paul would write letters, he would write to encourage churches. He would write to encourage leaders. And there was one leader, his name was Timothy. He became a pastor around the age of 18 or 19 years old. And he was in charge of a church that was the Las Vegas of the time. And Paul writes to him to encourage him and to give him some direction. But when he introduces himself in the letter, and now know this, they had a great relationship. But listen to how Paul talks about himself at the beginning of the letter. He says this, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the command of God our Savior, and of Christ Jesus our hope. He's not just, hi, it's Paul. He writes and says, God is doing something in me, and God is going to do something in you. He's one of those guys that would inspire you by just being around him. And he writes to Timothy to encourage him to say, hey, you're doing a good work and keep it up. Be faithful in what you're doing, because God is going to change lives through you. And hope affects change in two ways. The first is inward, and the second is outward. And often what we do in the church world, at least, and so if you're not a church person, you can laugh and mock at us for a moment. But often what we do in the church world is we do one or the other. Usually it's just inward. God is doing something inward. And so we're going to work on ourselves inward, and we eliminate ourselves outward. But what you need to know about the hope that you place in the hands of Jesus is that it changes you inward, and it influences who you are outward. If it doesn't come out, then something hasn't taken place inward. Does that make sense? And so what we want to talk about today is the way that it changes you inward and how it influences you outward, and why it's a shareable hope. So let's start with inside of you. And I got a couple of statements that I think are really important to make. And here's three of them. First, you can bring anything to God. There is nothing that's off limits with God. You can bring it to God. And second, you can talk to God about everything. And you don't have to be polite or respectful or religious with God. And if you don't believe me, then open up a Bible and read the Psalms. 50% of them, it's in the middle of the Bible in the Old Testament. 50% of them are laments or cries out to God, where they ask God some really difficult questions. And then the third thing, what God does is found in what he has promised. You see, often when we want God to do something, we have taken our opinion of what he should do and we've placed it on God. And we said, God, this is what you should do in this situation. This is how you should behave in this situation. But the reality is that God does what he promised, and he will do those things every single time. And here's one of his promises in John 16:33. He says this, "In this world you will have trouble." And if we were in a Southern Baptist church, everybody in the room would say, amen. But here's the truth. You may not even be a Bible believer this morning. You may not even trust the Bible. And when somebody asks you, hey, do you believe in the Bible? You can say, I don't, but there's this one verse that I do believe is true, where Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble. But he doesn't end it there. He says, take heart. I have overcome the world. Because he is very capable of holding the hope that you have in his hands. He is very capable of doing what he has promised. And so what I want to do is I want to take the promises of God, one specific promise of God, and talk about how we place our hope in his hands and what he does with that hope. There's a writer in the letter called Hebrews in the Bible. And this writer is writing to those people who have been in the Jewish world for a long time and they're trusting in Jesus for the first time. And he's walking them through what it looks like to place your hope in the hands of Jesus. It's a really powerful letter. If you ever want to just start somewhere in the Bible, this would be a great place to go. And what he says to the listeners, to the readers of these letters, are life-changing, and I think it'll be for you and for me this morning. And he says this, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith that we profess." Now, we don't use language like high priest in this environment. It might be foreign to you, so let me explain that. A high priest was somebody who was the go-between between God and people. The high priest would represent what God is like to the people. He would help the people honor God, follow God, confess things to God, and trust in God. And so this writer is writing to Jewish people who understood that analogy. For us, it would be like a teaching pastor, similar to what Ian does weekly for us, or what I get to do today. Somebody that explains what God is saying so that we can have an understanding, so that we can engage. And this writer says that our high priest is not just another man or a woman, but our high priest is Jesus. And that he is in heaven. He has ascended into heaven, and we can place our hope in him firmly. And he continues this way, "We do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses." Now, there is a difference between empathize and sympathize. Those that are sympathizers are those that say, man, I'm so sorry that happened. That breaks my heart. What can I do? How can I help? The empathizers say, I know how that feels. I've been there. You went through the divorce. I know how that feels. You lost someone you really cared about. I know how that feels. Sympathizers are great, and they will help bring change in your life. But having somebody who can empathize and take you in the direction of Jesus will change everything about you. And it says that our high priest, the one that stands between God and us, is Jesus. And that he doesn't just sympathize, but when he sees your pain and your suffering and your struggle and your brokenness, he doesn't go, man, I'm so sorry that that's happening. He says to you, I know how that feels. I've been there. I felt that. This is significant as we trust Jesus with the hope that we have to put in his hands. And the writer then says this, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are. So not only is he able to empathize because he's been there, but the writer says that he's been through it. So don't just believe this word that I'm saying to you, but understand that Jesus has been through what you have been through. And so let me give you a couple of examples. First, Jesus has spent a night dreading the events of the following day. Anyone in this room spent a night dreading the events of the following day? It could even be the test that you were taking in college the next day. Jesus spent a night dreading the events of the next day. And the next day was the cross, was crucifixion. He saw it. He smelt it. He experienced it. He saw people on crosses all the time. He lived in a Roman-dominated world. And Jesus dreaded the events of the next day. In fact, one of the writers of the Gospels says that he is in a garden praying, and he's so anxious and has so much anxiety and worry that he's sweating like drops of blood. And yet he says, God, not my will, but yours. Jesus experienced rejection and the betrayal of his closest friends. He experienced rejection and betrayal when he needed them most. When he was arrested and put on trial, everybody ran. Everybody left him. Nobody stayed next to him. Jesus saw everything he worked for crumble around him. One of the men that he invested in the most actually said 3 times on the night that Jesus was going to be tried and then the next day going to be crucified, this man named Peter actually denied 3 times that he even knew Jesus. And Jesus experienced crushing temptation. Crushing temptation. He's been through what you have been through. And yet the writer says this next, which is so significant for us. He says, and yet he did not sin. See, we go through our life and we missed our life with saying yes to us and no to God. And eventually we find ourselves in a fog. We find ourselves not knowing what way is up or down or right or left, and we have allowed temptation to shape the reality of our perspective. Sin is when we are aiming and we actually miss what God has created us for. And yet Jesus experienced all that you and I experienced and yet said yes to the Father over and over and over again, and never said, I don't want to do that, I want to do what I want. And this is so important for us because this is true about Jesus, then it perhaps would change the way that we approach Jesus. That we can trust that when we put our hope in his very capable hands, that he actually can handle it. He knows how it feels, and he knows the direction that we should go. He can get us from here to there. And maybe just in a very small way, it might change how you approach God in trying to convince God how it feels. In trying to convince God that he should act on your behalf. Because when you approach God, he says, I know how it feels because I've been there. And because of this, the writer continues with some very powerful words. He says this, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence. Notice it doesn't say formality. And notice it doesn't say religiously. If your expression of God is to approach him formally, is to approach him politely, is to approach him in all sorts of religion, then you do not know God. Because God is not a God who says, here's the hoops that you have to jump through. He says, I can hold your hope in my very capable hands, and because of that, I know how you feel, I know what you've been through, and because of that, you can approach me with confidence, with boldness, with strength, and say, God, here's what's taking place in my life. Remember, you can say anything to God, and you can bring everything to God, and God will do what he has promised. God will follow through in what he has promised. And here's what he's promised. First, the writer says this, so that we may receive. Here's what you need to know. That every time you approach God, you receive something. Every time you go before God, you receive something. It's a guarantee because he said that it's a guarantee. Where we get messed up often is that we decide he's going to give me this, but what he really has promised is this. And so this will be significant in our hope today and what God does in us today. Because when we understand that we will receive something and then we get a clear picture of what it is that we will receive, I believe it'll change you and it'll change me. And the first thing that we receive is mercy. Mercy. Our high priest, Jesus, when we approach him and place our hope in his hands with all of our mess and all of our junk and everything that we believe is wrong, things that we're embarrassed about, shameful about, struggling in, sad about, questioning, we go before God and we place it in his hands, and he responds with mercy every single time. The word actually in the Greek is pistos. Sounds like a word you shouldn't say at church, right? But the word actually means, it's an action word. And you know what it looks like? It's like a father scooping up its child when it fell and bringing it close and telling them that it's going to be all right. That's literally what the word looks like in action. Mercy. That God is coming to you, and not because it's a serious issue, but he's taking it serious because it's your issue. You're listening to your child when they bring something to you. God does the same thing, and he takes it serious because it's your issue. Mercy scoops you up and says, I know, I've been there, and I felt it. And then sometimes mercy can be a very tangible experience for us, can it? God, I'm lonely and I'm broken and I'm scared and I just don't know what to do with these thoughts. And then you get a text message or a phone call. Other times mercy can be very tangible, but not outward, maybe just inward, where as you cried out to God with tears and with pain and with anguish, you said some things to God, and at the end of that conversation, there was just a sense of in your heart. Because God, every time you approach him, is a God who will scoop you up and hold you close and say, I know how that feels, and I've been there. But then there's another thing that we receive, not just mercy, but it says this, and find grace to help us in our time of need. Grace is something that we all need. Grace is the strength to endure. Grace means that he may not remove it from you, but he will take you through it. He will walk you through it. And you know that you've experienced it when you've said things like, I don't ever want to go back to that situation again, but I wouldn't change anything. Because you saw what happened in you. Maybe the circumstances didn't change, but something in you changed. You were able to say yes when you felt like you couldn't. You were able to continue to move forward when it felt like you were going to break down. God says, every time you approach me, you will receive mercy and you will receive grace. And this is how we approach God. This is what we do when we place our hope in the very capable hands of Jesus. Grace and mercy are unlimited. And it allows us to be courageous and bold. We never have to question. I don't care if you're a church person or not, a Christian or not. You need to know this, and so listen very closely. You never have to question how God will receive you. You may have to question how your mother-in-law will, but you never have to question how God will. You may have to question how your kids will, but you'll never have to question how Jesus will. Every time you go before him, every time you approach him, it doesn't matter your attitude, it doesn't matter your perspective. Every time you approach him, every time you take your hope and you want to place it in his hands, you receive mercy and you receive grace. And that could change us. That could change how we respond to the things outside of us, which really, remember, hope affects us inward and then it affects us outward. One of the heroes of faith for me is a woman by the name of Mother Teresa. I love Mother Teresa. She passed away years ago, but the work that she did on this earth is still lasting. It's still significant. She was a young woman at an early age that decided that she was going to dedicate her life to the work of Jesus. And one of the things that she committed to was to work in Calcutta at an orphanage where kids who didn't have families, didn't have parents, didn't have anything that they could lean on and run to when they scraped their knee, she was going to help fulfill that role and eventually help these kids perhaps find a family that could fulfill that role. But one of her commitments was, they will know Jesus when they see me. One of the significant things about Mother Teresa is years ago, her diaries were printed in one of a very prominent magazine. And in these diaries for the last 21 years of her life were a lot of questions to God, were a lot of issues and struggles, a lot of anxiety that she dealt with. And yet, publicly, nothing changed. She was somebody who was consistent in her faithfulness to Jesus. And yet, privately, she was asking all sorts of questions. Mother Teresa tangibly understood this idea of placing your hope in Jesus' hands and receiving mercy and grace. She wrote things like, God, am I where I should be? God, this is really hard, and I think I may need to do something else. God, are you even present in my life? Mother Teresa wrote this. If there was anybody on the upper echelons of who's great and who's godly, wouldn't we put her at the very top or at least close to the top? And yet she's asking these very important questions because she's not approaching God with formality. She's not approaching God with religion. She's approaching God in intimacy. And she understood that keeping those things hidden from God was, one, silly, and two, it breaks intimacy. There was a man named Shane Claiborne that wanted to work with Mother Teresa, and so he actually flew to Calcutta to serve there for a few years, and he began to notice something interesting about Mother Teresa. He noticed her feet. And so he, not wanting to ask her about her feet, it's just probably a question you don't ask. You don't ask a woman her age, and probably don't ask her about her feet, right? And so he didn't want to ask her about that, so he asked one of the leaders about her feet, and he said, does she have some sort of arthritis? Does she have some sort of issue? Why is her feet that way? Is there a way that we can help her get better? Could we take her to a hospital? What could we do? And one of the leaders looked at him and smiled and said, Shane, you have no idea about Mother Teresa if you're asking about her feet and you're questioning if she would want to get it fixed. And he said, wait, what do you mean? And the leader responded, we're an orphanage and people send all sorts of donations to us. And we're thankful for those donations. And sometimes they're brand new donations and other times they're used donations, but everyone that comes, we're grateful and we're thankful for it. We get shoe donations all the time. And Mother Teresa has made it the commitment of her life as a leader here that every time shoes come, she will make sure every kid and every leader get a pair of shoes before she even tries a pair on. She will make sure that everybody gets the brand new pair before she even gets a pair. And the reason why her feet are that way is because she always takes the worst pair of shoes, and most of the time, they don't even fit. And Shane asked, well, doesn't that make her uncomfortable? And the leader said, well, what do you think? And yet, he saw a very tangible expression of hope. Because sometimes, hope might affect you inward. And all the time, it shows itself outward. And for Mother Teresa, her hope was shown in crooked toes because she wanted people around her to experience the God that she knows and she loves. And in a very tangible way, it was giving them the better pair of shoes. Because for Mother Teresa, convenience wasn't her story. Service was. Comfort wasn't her story. Courage was. And selfishness wasn't her story. Humility was. Hope had changed her inwardly. She had placed her hope in the very strong and capable hands of Jesus. And as we learned in those diaries, she was somebody that continued to progress and grow and question and decide, Jesus, what are you doing in my life? But it didn't change what she did for the Lord. It didn't change what she did for Jesus. Her hope changed her. And I know that maybe this morning you're thinking, I want that kind of hope. Maybe you are a Christian and you're saying, yet I still want that kind of hope. Or maybe you're not a Christian and you're saying, I would love to live that way. That's a great commitment. It's a difficult commitment. Because just like Mother Teresa struggled with it, even in her old age, even as she followed Jesus faithfully, she struggled in it. Because the words of Jesus don't invite us to convenience or comfort or selfishness. It invites us to change. It invites us to life. It invites us to joy. It invites us to say, I don't want to place my hope in this thing or that thing, in my job or my resources or my family. I want to place my hope in the one that can handle it, and that is Jesus. And when I receive grace and mercy, then that's what I can give away. And when that's our perspective, then words like what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, actually become even more powerful. He says this, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, most of us in this room may say, okay, I'm going to work on loving my enemies. Or some of us in this room might say, well, I don't really have any enemies, but if I did have enemies, I would love them. And so I'm a big believer that it's really important for us to take the words of Jesus and actually apply them to today. And so maybe if Jesus was speaking to us today, maybe this is what he would say. Love the Republicans and pray for those who vote differently than you do. Don't you like how awkward it just got here in this room? By the way, Republicans, you're not off the hook. The next thing that he would probably say is, love the Democrats and pray for those who see the world differently than you do. If you've placed your hope in the hands of Jesus, you don't have to attack. You don't have to complain. You don't have to blame. You don't have to argue. Because you understand that you've received grace and mercy in moments where you didn't deserve it, and that those that see the world differently than you need the same thing, because our number one desire is not that people would become like us. Our number one desire, the thing that we want to make shareable, is the hope that we have in Jesus Christ. Because hope changes you so that change will come through you. Hope changes you so that change will come through you. Hope is real when it's felt by those around you. And so my invitation to you, my invitation to everybody in this room, is that it's time to place your hope in the person who knows what to do with it. Not in the idea, not in the thought, but in the person, Jesus, who knows what to do with your hope. And that's why we have Baptism Sunday. Because today could be a significant day for you. And before we go any further, Pastor Ian wanted to share a couple of words with you about baptism. So would you check out the screen?